All right. Everybody's grades are now up on the on Blackboard, so if you've got a question about something, feel free to contact me. You should all have a grade there. If you don't, then it's, you know, I messed up and didn't post it, so check for me. I checked everything. I didn't see any that I missed, but you know, I'm kind of old and sometimes I mess up, so y'all let me know if there's a problem. Grades were really, really good on that test, so I was impressed with it. I don't think I had any failures. If I did, I just had one. I don't remember for sure. So
Karen.
very, very good. Karen didn't do so well, but the rest of you were fine. All right, so now we're going to talk about the age of Jackson. And in the interest of fairness, you know, I always try and tell you my biases. I really like Andrew Jackson, so take that with a grain of salt as we go through here. There's a lot of stuff not to like about it. And I'll tell you that most historians are not fans of Andrew Jackson anymore. He's not seen as he's not very popular right now. But I think he largely invented the system of government we have today. All right, to kind of set the mood, that top left picture is the bust of Jackson at the Capitol. The middle picture is Jackson Square in New Orleans, where there's a giant statue of Andrew Jackson in front of the cathedral. At least for now there is. New Orleans has voted to remove it, so it's probably going to be gone soon.
That makes me so sad.
That makes me sad too, because
So sad.
every time I go to New Orleans, I have to, you know, make my pilgrimage to the statue of Jackson and pay my homage to him. The top right picture is the Hermitage. That is our Jackson's home. And the bottom three pictures are all Jackson, different times in his career. First as a lawyer, and the other two as a military officer. So you can kind of get a feel for what this guy was like. Another man, along with Thomas Jefferson, the only other person that is so dominant that a whole time period has his name in American history. So the age of Jackson. This era is characterized by a rise of a new populism. If you don't know what populism is, it's the genuine belief that government should be ran by the people, and it's a support for the people. Well, by the 1820s, most Americans had the right to vote. Democracy had spread dramatically. What that means is they'd gotten rid of most of the property restrictions. Now, blacks still couldn't vote, women still couldn't vote, American Indians still couldn't vote, but the property restrictions were gone, so most white men could vote. There were some exceptions. Felons couldn't, but other than that, you had the right to vote. As a result of spreading the vote out, of getting more of the poor people voting, we're going to get a different kind of politician. We're going to get everyman politicians. Politicians with humble backgrounds, or at least the perception of a humble background. Most of the time, they really weren't from the poor classes, but they could make you believe they were. Indian fighters became incredibly popular among the politicians of this age. And we've got four of them up there. The top left picture, that's William Henry Harrison, the guy that had defeated Tecumseh, the governor of the Indiana Territory. He actually sells himself as a common person, as a log cabin politician. Somebody that the average person likes. In reality, his father was a delegate from Virginia that signed the Declaration of Independence. I mean, he comes from a wealthy family. But he sells himself that way. Andrew Jackson is the greatest of the common men. He literally came from nothing to rise up to the office of the presidency eventually. And he spoke a common language. He spoke the language of every man. In fact, Andrew Jackson once said, this reminds me of some of y'all after I graded your tests. Andrew Jackson once said that he was smarter than the average person because he could spell words in more than one way. Some of you can spell words in more than one way, sometimes in the same sentence. So Andrew Jackson, big one of these guys. Davy Crockett, that's him at the bottom left. David Crockett, or Davy Crockett, another Tennessean, a man that rose to fame on his own stories of tall tales They would tell stories about Davy Crockett being so tough that he would grin at a bear until the bear laid down and died. Now, these stories went around, and Davy Crockett got elected to Congress based on them. He later on got in an argument with Andrew Jackson, fell out of favor and lost his re-election bid, and famously asked to speak to Congress one last time, where he held up a glass of whiskey and said, "You may all go to hell, I'm going to Texas." That's a common man kind of thing. Goes on and dies at the Alamo. And Sam Houston, there at the bottom right, another Tennessean, is a common man politician. And probably the most interesting one of the bunch. If you were in a Texas history class, we'd spend a lot of time on Sam Houston. He ran away from home when he was 14 years old to live with the Indians because he didn't want to be a shopkeeper. He comes back, joins the Army, ends up serving underneath Andrew Jackson in the Indian Wars, becomes a congressman, and then finally he becomes governor of Tennessee when Andrew Jackson goes on to become president. Drinks himself into disgrace, resigns the governorship, comes to Texas, goes on to become our first president and our governor. The only man in history to be governor of 2 states and president of his own republic in his own lifetime. Pretty incredible. And by the way, in 1860, Sam Houston was the front runner expected to win the presidency when he chose not to run and Abraham Lincoln was elected instead. So that tells you something about how big of a guy this was. What makes it possible? What makes it possible is the fact that common men were able to vote. And this idea of Jacksonian democracy, the belief that even a common man can do the job. Andrew Jackson once said, if there's a job that a common Democrat can't do, get rid of the job. Okay? So that kind of tells you what was going on. So 1828 comes along, and Andrew Jackson has ran a 4-year campaign. He had the 1824 election stolen from him, essentially. So he spends the next 4 years running for president against John Quincy Adams, the incumbent. And this was a dirty, dirty, dirty election. I love this election. You think that Trump and Clinton were bad. Nothing compared to these two. They were bad candidates, but they weren't nearly as dirty. Andrew Jackson ran as a member of a brand new political party. He's no longer calling himself a Democratic Republican. He's just calling himself a Democrat. He's the first of the modern Democratic Party. He's powerful in the West and South. And he's running against John Quincy Adams, who is now calling himself a national Republican. He's popular in New England. And while the incumbent always has an advantage, Andrew Jackson is able to run, he's able to run a campaign that says, I should have been president already. I got more votes than Jackson, or Adams stole the election. Let's look at the accusations that are made. Andrew Jackson accused John Quincy Adams of being a British tool, a tool of the crown who is just going to do whatever the King of England wants him to do. Why would he say this? Well, John Quincy Adams had had very good relationships with England. He had opened trade back up with them. He had been an ambassador to England before. He knew the King of England personally. Well, in the South and the West, where they hate everything British, this is not going to play well. Next, they accuse Adams of being a monarchist, just like his father was. What is a monarchist? It's somebody that wants to be king, wants to be treated as something special. So, this is a wonderful thing, a wonderful accusation to make, because think about it. Jackson had been, or Adams had been the son of a king, or son of a president. Now he is a president. Wow, I'm just bringing me food and coffee now. Well-trained students. I love it.
Mr. Albert,
yes.
we're having a fire drill.
All right, well, I'm recording this, so you'll be able to catch on to it. I'm sorry, guys.
OMG, they're like running.
Wow, fire drill. Okay. So, they accuse him of being a monarchist. Now, did John Quincy Adams want to be king? I don't think so. But he was, like his father, believing that the president should be something a lot more respected, with a lot more, fanciness to it, okay? The last one, they accused Adams of having a gambling problem. This is absolutely hilarious. John Quincy Adams is a Puritan. He is not a gambler. Why would they make the accusation? Well, he had a pool table put in the White House. And in Jackson's mind, the only reason to have a pool table is to gamble on it. So he must be gambling. Okay? So, are the accusations good that were made against Adams? Well, I don't think any of them really stick. They all have a degree of truth. But, Jackson is really slinging the mud at him. Okay? Now let's look at the accusations that John Quincy Adams made. John Quincy Adams accused Jackson of gambling as well. This is true. Andrew Jackson had won and lost fortunes in his life. He raised racehorses and gambled on them. He was a big card player. He would gamble on his own shooting ability. Jackson was a big gambler. That one sticks. Except with Jackson, he doesn't see it as a bad thing. When they accused Jackson of being a gambler, he said, yes, want to bet? Jackson was ready to turn it into a positive because people in the South and West had no problem with gambling. Okay? They accused Jackson of murder. Murder? In a debate, I love this story. John Quincy Adams stood up and said, if you elect this man, Andrew Jackson, president, you will be electing a man that has killed at least 4 men in cold blood in his life. He's a murderer. And Andrew Jackson stood up. He slapped the table. He said, that is a damned lie. I've killed a lot more men than that. He was proud of it. Now he points out, he says, it wasn't murder. I killed him in duels, which were legal. He had killed 4 men in duels in his life. And I've ordered the death of many other people in Florida and in the Creek Wars. But they were all justified killings. And frankly, in the South and the West, he needed killing was a pretty good defense. Okay? So he turns it into a positive for it.
So it wasn't in cold blood, basically.
It was what?
It wasn't in the cold blood, technically.
No, it wasn't. Well, it may have been in cold blood, but it wasn't a crime.
Right.
It wasn't a crime. The next one is that they accused, this is the bad one, or one of them at least. They accused Jackson's mother of being a prostitute. Can you imagine a presidential election where you accuse someone's mother of being a prostitute?
You run out of all.
The original
I could actually imagine Trump doing that. What's the degree of truth in this? Well, this to me is the low blow. Jackson's mother had been raped by a British soldier during the American Revolution. And in John Quincy Adams' mind, if you have sex outside of wedlock, you're a prostitute. That was his justification. Okay? Now, all of us are sitting here going, that is not a prostitute. But that's the way Adams sells it. By the way, Jackson never forgives him for that, and he in fact challenged John Quincy Adams to a duel. That would have been a great way to pick the presidency. And here we go. The last one. They accuse Jackson's wife and Jackson himself of committing adultery. Wow. Talk about insulting somebody. Where does this come from? Well, Rachel, Andrew Jackson's wife, had been married before she married Andrew Jackson. She was a child bride. She was given to her father had arranged a marriage when she was still a teenager. And this man had apparently abused her and abandoned her. He disappeared for years at a time. While he was gone, she filed papers for abandonment, and she met a young officer, Andrew Jackson, who then married Rachel in a frontier wedding. The problem was, it turned out that the papers they filed for abandonment, which is divorce basically, were filed with the judge, but the judge then never filed them with the state of North Carolina. So legally, Rachel was still married to her first husband when she married Andrew Jackson. Therefore, when Andrew Jackson and Rachel consummated their marriage, they were committing adultery. He was sleeping with somebody that wasn't his wife, his legal wife. So, legally, did they commit adultery? Yeah, I mean, I guess legally they did. But in reality, not really. It was a paperwork error. But Rachel's embarrassed by this. Jackson is embarrassed. And in the election that Jackson wins, Rachel makes it all the way through, but she dies before the final count. She never gets to see her husband elected. And Jackson blames Adams for it. He says, "My Rachel died of a broken heart." Well, she did. She had a heart attack. But he blames Adams, and he says, it was the stress you put on her with these accusations. And it might have been. For the rest of his life, Jackson and Adams are not going to be able to see eye to eye. But you see, he wins 178 to 83. What's the big difference here between the Jackson accusations and the Adams accusations? Well, the Adams accusations were usually true, while the Jackson ones usually weren't. Okay? There's a degree of truth to all of it, but I would say, and this is from my perspective, that the Jackson people were a little looser with the truth than the Adams people were. Okay? This is a picture of John Marshall swearing in Andrew Jackson. I love that picture of Andrew Jackson. He looks like he ought to be the guitar player for the Rolling Stones in that picture.
Was he tall? He looks like
He was a very tall man, yeah. Jackson comes in, and he comes in on the backs of all these commoners voting. And people seem to genuinely believe that Jackson has saved them from monarchy. And when he holds his inaugural ball, most presidents have an inaugural ball. I like to call this one the inaugural bowl because it's more like a Super Bowl party than it is a ball. Most presidents have a nice big orchestra and they play classical music and they waltz and drink champagne. Andrew Jackson had the equivalent of a hillbilly jug band. They served beer and cheese, and he invited the general public. They trashed the White House. So many people showed up that night they couldn't end the party. The party went into the wee hours, and Andrew Jackson spends his first night as president in a nearby hotel. Andrew Jackson, who is not a young man, is almost trampled by the mob trying to shake his hand. His vice president, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, is so embarrassed by this. Calhoun is a proper gentleman, and he doesn't think this is the way an inauguration should be. By the way, if you ever get a chance to go to an inauguration, they are pretty awesome to go to. I haven't been to a president's one, but I've been to 2 governors' inaugurations, and when George Bush was inaugurated governor, it got a little wild like this. It was a little more of a beer and cheese party than a champagne party. That's a picture of the White House from outside. It's an artist's rendering of what the inaugural party looked like. And you can see the party got a little out of control. I don't know if you can tell or not, but there's furniture out there on the lawn. They literally took the couches out of the White House and brought them in the front lawn. Parts of the White House caught on fire from cigars. The rugs were damaged. Furniture had to be reupholstered when it was done. It was a frat house party. So let's get to know this guy, Andrew Jackson, a little more. Andrew Jackson is the New West. He is the man that moved out west to Tennessee, and it reinvented himself as a southern plantation owner out there. He is a man of the people and very much a self-made man. His men called him Old Hickory. Now that might not sound like a good name to you, but hickory was one of the hardest things these people would have known. If any of you have ever had to split firewood and you ever had to split a hickory log, you'll understand very quickly it's like splitting rocks, okay? So a hickory stick was something that was tough, and that's why they called him that. Think about how tough this guy was. During his life, he caught dysentery, he caught malaria, he got tuberculosis, and he was shot twice. Both times the bullets were so close to organs, they couldn't remove them, so the lead bullets were left in his body, and he had lead poisoning. Any one of these things would kill the average person. Jackson survives all of them. It may explain Jackson's crazy behavior later in life that he had lead poisoning, by the way. That's one of the things, one of the characteristics that makes you very volatile. He was a self-taught lawyer. That means he didn't go to school. He just read law books with a lawyer until the lawyer said, you know the law well enough, and allowed him to practice. You used to be able to do that. I wish you still could. He was a frontier judge. There's a great story about him that may or may not be true. It's probably apocryphal. But there was a story about Jackson that said that he pulled into town as a circuit judge. So he traveled from town to town at different times and caught their court cases up. He showed up on his circuit, and there was a case he was hearing, and somebody got drunk out in the streets and were shooting the streets up, shooting guns off in the streets. And Andrew Jackson ordered the bailiff or the cop to go out and arrest the man or make the man stop. So the bailiff went out and came back in and said, "Sir, I can't do it. He won't give me his guns back." And according to the story, Judge Jackson gavelled the recess into a 10-minute session, stepped out into the street, and with a hickory stick took the gun away from the man and came back in, gavelled it back in session. And when they asked the man, why didn't you shoot Andrew Jackson? He said, when I looked at Andrew Jackson, I saw shoot. Now what that means is he was afraid of Andrew Jackson. Now, is the story true? Probably not. But what's important is people believed the story was true. Now, for people to believe a story like that is true, you have to already be tough. Okay? And that just shows how much of a reputation this guy had. He gets elected to Congress, goes on to become governor later on. He was a Western aristocrat, so he's a slave owner and raises horses and owns a large amount of land in the West, but he always talks like the common man. He believes in the power of the people over all, and the power of the state over the national government, at least until he becomes president. And then he starts acting a little more nationalistic, as often happens. Conservatives hated him. They called him King Mob. They believed that he was leading by power of force. And their fear of him was that Jackson was so popular with the mob of common people that if they didn't do what Andrew Jackson wanted, the people would rise up against them. And they probably would have. Okay? Again, people seem to generally believe that Andrew Jackson had rescued the nation from the monarchists. If I go too fast, y'all let me know. I love this cartoon. This has been on the STAR test before. It's also been on the AP test before. So it's something that we see a lot. It's Andrew Jackson dressed in all the regalia of a king. I don't know if y'all can read it or not, but it says born to command at the top. King Andrew the First on the excuse me, of veto memory on the left and had I been consulted on the right. And he's standing on a torn up copy of the Constitution. The reason they did this is because the artist is trying to say that Andrew Jackson is now so powerful that he doesn't even need the Constitution. He's able to just completely ignore it. And we'll see that sometimes he did. Sometimes he did ignore it. Jackson is attacked frequently for his use of the spoils system. Spoils system is one of your terms for on your next test, by the way. It's where you appoint loyal officials to government jobs. Jackson is credited with it, although he didn't invent it. It had always been around. Jackson just openly admitted to doing it. He rewarded people that were loyal to him in an election with jobs. So the thought being, if you help get Andrew Jackson elected, I'm going to make you a judge, or I'm going to make you a postmaster, I'm going to get you some kind of a job, or I'm going to give you a job in my cabinet. Now people attack this because it sounds like bribery. And maybe it is, but are there good things about the spoils system? There are some really good things about it. It means you're surrounding yourself by people that are loyal to you, and your government is going to be incredibly efficient. Things got done very quickly under the spoils system. The bad part, sometimes you reward the wrong people. I don't know about you, but I've had friends in my life before that I discovered later on probably weren't the best choices for me to have as friends. Well, he did that too. Guys like Samuel Swartwell, he appointed him customs collector in New York City, where he promptly stole $1 million from the federal government. Not a great appointment. Jackson also believed in rotation in office. He didn't leave anybody in office too long. About every 2 years, when there was another election, he replaced all the officials because he had a lot of people he needed to reward. So you might be Postmaster General, but in 2 years you're stepping down and somebody else is going to be Postmaster General. Okay? Pretty effective. By the way, we still use the spoils system. We just don't call it that anymore. Let's talk about tariffs a little bit. Tariffs used to be a lot more important than they are today. A tariff is a tax on imported goods. And back in 1828, before Jackson was elected, there was a tariff pushed through by Congress. It was really John Quincy Adams' tariff. It put a 45% tariff on all imported manufactured goods. 45%. That is massive. Okay? Massive. Think about that. If you bought a $100 product, it would cost you $145. Okay? Big tariff. People in the South and the West despised it. Because, first off, we didn't have any money. And second, we didn't have any manufacturing. They kind of liked it in the North because they did have manufacturing and it made foreign goods more expensive, so we would buy more crappy American goods. Okay? And American goods were crappy back then. Our manufacturing wasn't nearly as good as England's. Well, Jackson came in, and while he doesn't like the tariff, Congress pushed it through, and he believes it's his job to enforce it. So he says, we're going to enforce this tariff. Okay? Jackson gets it hung over his neck. 1832 comes along, and Jackson's got to run for re-election. And he pushes through a tariff. This actually lowered the tariff. The tariff of 1832 actually lowered it. It lowered the tariff to 35%. But that's still a massive tariff. Okay? Still a massive tariff. And a lot of people in the South, they wanted the tariff gone. Particularly in South Carolina, which, by the way, is now the source of trouble in the country. South Carolina, in about 1830, replaces Rhode Island as the biggest piece of trouble in the country, the most rebellious area. And there's an anonymous letter written called the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. It's written anonymously, but everybody knows who wrote it. John C. Calhoun wrote it. That's Andrew Jackson's vice president. How do they know it? Well, think about it. You know when you get your favorite author, you can just recognize their writing? Well, at that time period, everybody wrote everything, and you could recognize stuff, and Calhoun had written a lot of stuff. You know his writing stuff. It would be like if the Beatles released an album and didn't tell you it was them. We'd all know it was the Beatles, okay? I know that's an old reference there. Nobody else. You and I would know the Beatles. Nobody else would. But
Well, everybody should though, because they're very distinct.
they're very distinct. Very distinct. All right, so he writes this, and everybody knows it was Calhoun. Jackson is furious because in the exposition and protest, he says, the state of South Carolina nullifies this law and refuses to collect the tax. So now, look at the positions you're in. Andrew Jackson has passed the tax, the president, and the vice president is saying, we're not collecting it. You have the president against the vice president. So these nullies in South Carolina passed the nullifying act. We're not going to collect it. Jackson is furious. Jackson says, you're going to collect it or else. And the people of South Carolina say, if you try and collect it, we are going to secede from the Union. If you don't know what that means, it means we're going to leave the Union and form our own country. This is in 1832. 30 years before the Civil War. Okay? Jackson decides the answer is I'm going to write my own letter. So he writes a response to Calhoun's letter. His is called the Proclamation of the People of South Carolina. It's not nearly as pretty as Calhoun's. It uses very common language. And what I love about it is it says that if South Carolina doesn't repeal the Nullification Act and collect the tax legally, he says, I'm going to personally lead an army into South Carolina. I'm going to declare you in rebellion, and I'm going to hang the organizers. So now we have the president threatening to lead an army in and hang the vice president. We could have had our Civil War right here.
Gotta know your place.
We almost had our Civil War. But in writes Henry Clay. Henry Clay, the guy that we call the Great Compromiser. He comes in with a compromise. He says, this is what we're going to do. We're going to gradually reduce the tariff by 10% over the next 8 years. A little over a percentage a year. That's there to please the nullifiers. We're going to lower it, but it also pleases Jackson because they're still keeping the tariff. It's just going down. The tariff's still there. But the other side to please Jackson is he passes a force bill, sometimes called the Bloody Bill, that authorized the president to lead an army in if he had to. Very quickly, South Carolina repealed the nullification ordinance, and we averted civil war. Why do you think they repealed it? Because they believed that Jackson really would lead an army into there.
He probably would too.
Y'all think he would have?
Yes.
I absolutely think he would have. I think he would have gloriously led an army and gleefully hung the vice president. Okay? That's Jackson at the top. That's Henry Clay at the bottom right and John C. Calhoun at the bottom left. Way to remember it, Jackson looks like he ought to be the guitarist for the Rolling Stones. Henry Clay looks like Hillary Clinton. And John C. Calhoun looks like the Crypt Keeper. So, all right. I'm sorry he does look like Hillary Clinton. I don't care.
No, the one of Calhoun.
Huh?
The one of Calhoun.
That was amazing hair, wasn't it? I wish I could grow hair so I could have it like that.
It would probably look like that though. Because
It would if I could grow it.
yeah.
Yeah. All right. So what's the roots of this tariff argument? The tariff argument goes all the way back to Jefferson and Madison's claims in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. Remember I told you back, we talked about those? Remember this? It's going to be important. They had argued way back in the 1780s that states can nullify a federal law. That argument's back now. And that argument is going to be the single biggest argument all the way through the end of the Civil War. And really, states' rights versus national rights is still the biggest argument we have in this country today. Does the state have the power? Does the federal government have the power? Or are you an anarchist and believe nobody has the power? You're not an anarchist, Tyler.
No, nobody has the power.
You're a libertine. All right. It's also the urban north versus the rural south. That's also an argument we still have today. Look at an election map. The red states and the blue states. The blue states tend to be urban states. The red states tend to be rural states. We're still having this same argument.
Would you wait? So if it were up to the state, do you think that would be like more freedom than the feds?
Well, I don't know if it's more freedom, but it's closer to the people, because we tend to know our state representatives and our state senators personally.
Right.
I mean, I can go to our state representative's house and talk to him. I know the guy. I do know our congressman, but if I showed up at his house, somebody might shoot me.
It just wouldn't be as comfortable.
Yeah, it's a different situation. You're closer to the people. Yeah.
So do you agree with states more than you would the federal?
I am very much a smaller government guy. I think
I would
the
say
power
so.
should be more in the states. I'm almost crazy anarchist guy. I'm libertarian with. I want like one law. Don't kill people. You know, if we just do that one, everything is good. All right. So who won the tariff argument? This is a good compromise because both sides can claim victory. The Nollists say we won, the tariff was reduced. The Unionists say we won, the tariff is still there. There are a lot of historians later on that say that they should have just let Jackson go at this point, and that if Jackson would have just gone into South Carolina and crushed this revolt then, we never would have had our Civil War. That's a possibility. I don't know that it would have worked out. But interestingly, our Civil War in 1861 starts in South Carolina. So maybe we could have. Jackson's Bank War. Andrew Jackson hated the Bank of the United States. Absolutely hated it. He was one of the victims of the Bank of the United States. He had borrowed money whenever the property bubble burst, and they recalled loans on him, and he'd been foreclosed on. So he wants to get rid of it. And he at least claims that his reason for wanting to get rid of the Bank of the United States is because it's unconstitutional. By the way, it is unconstitutional. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say that we have a right for a Bank of the United States. But some people have found it in the elastic clause that says that for the general good of the nation and full faith and credit, you can make banks. So his plan was to let the bank die a natural death. The bank was scheduled to die a death in 1836. It would have to be rechartered. But in 1832, Henry Clay says, I'm going to embarrass Jackson. And he pushes through a bill forcing the Bank of the United States to recharter early. And his thought was, he's going to make half the country mad no matter what. Jackson has to either sign it or veto it. And half the country love the bank, half the country hates the bank. No matter what he does, somebody's going to get mad. And this Henry Clay believes will damage Jackson so bad that Henry Clay can challenge him and win the election. What they expected Jackson to do was to quietly veto the bill and hope nobody ever notices. That was a dumb idea to expect, because Jackson has never quietly done anything in his life. Instead, Jackson comes out, he publicly vetoes the bill, he challenges the public to show me where in the Constitution it says you can have a bank, and he says, I'm protecting you from the evil, unconstitutional statist people, and America rose up and loved him for it.
So he was a victim of it, though?
He had been a victim earlier in his life, yeah.
Oh.
He'd lost money to the bank earlier.
So he didn't
And that's why I hated it, because it wasn't even real.
Yeah, well, he
Like,
doesn't think it,
wasn't constitutional.
yeah, it wasn't constitutional, at least he said that was his reason. So, the charter bill fails. Now, that doesn't mean the bank is gone. Remember, the charter doesn't run out till 1836, so it's still got 4 years. But Jackson now says, I'm so mad, I'm really going to kill the bank. He withdraws all of the money from the bank, all of the United States money, and he puts it in what he calls pet banks, little state banks all over the country. What he did was he bankrupted the Bank of the United States. This was a stupid decision, because the Bank of the United States now has to recall loans to pay their bills, and it caused a depression. It was a bad move on Jackson's part. I think he was right in not rechartering, but I think he was wrong in withdrawing the money and bankrupting it, okay? It's interesting that John Marshall, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, comes out and says, Mr. Jackson, Mr. President, you're wrong. The bank is constitutional. And Jackson ignored him and did what he wanted to anyway, as Jackson is wont to do. So how's the bank going to respond to this? Somebody go open that door, please. The bank is going to respond by going to war against the president. A guy named Nicholas Biddle was in charge of the Bank of the United States.
That's the dude?
That's the dude,
That
yes.
was like a girl.
Nicholas Biddle had a pretty unfortunate name. I suspect he was made fun of a lot. But in order to try and defeat Andrew Jackson in 1832, he loans money to anti-Jackson newspapers. Think about that. We have the Bank of the United States loaning money to newspapers that are writing bad stories about the president. In all reality, Biddle was a pretty good manager of the bank. He'd ran funds well. So we have this war between Jackson and the bank.
Was it still, like, bad to talk about the president during that time, or no?
That law had been repealed whenever Jefferson was president.
Okay.
He repealed the Sedition Act. I've already talked about this, so I'm not going to go over it again.
Forgot about that.
This is a picture. This is an editorial cartoon of the time period. I don't know if you can tell it or not, but that's Jackson vetoing the bank. That's Davy Crockett next to him. And all the people running away seem to be demons, okay? So Jackson is killing the devil. All right, so let's see how well Henry Clay's plan was. Remember, Henry Clay's whole reason for trying to recharter the bank was to embarrass Andrew Jackson and win the presidency. So in 1832, he runs against him. That's Henry Clay on the right. That's Jackson on the left. And you can see that it wasn't even close. Andrew Jackson is reelected with 219 electoral votes to Henry Clay's 49. Okay? Henry Clay managed to carry his home state and very little else. Somebody get the door, please. Y'all need to stop walking in and out. Let's talk about the American Indians
Just crack it a little bit.
in the Southeast. I want to get through this Indian part at least today. By 1820, most Indians have been pushed well to the west. But there's still somewhere between 100,000 and 120,000 living east of the Mississippi River. Most of those guys in Georgia. But the ones that are left are the civilized tribes. Remember those guys from earlier in the class? They were the Indians that we liked because they acted like we did. Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole. Well, here's the problem. Gold is found on Indian land in Georgia. What do you think's about to happen?
I'm about to take it over.
We're going to push the Indians off the land, okay? So we say we gotta find some way to get rid of them. And the legislature of Georgia ordered the Cherokee off their land. Here's the problem. They had already signed a treaty with the U.S. government promising them this land into perpetuity, forever. So what are the Cherokee going to do? Remember, they're one of the civilized tribes. And civilized means like us, right? So the civilized tribes do the single most civilized thing they can do. Instead of going to war against the U.S. government, they go to court against them. They sue Georgia. I missed one somewhere. I'm skipping some of these. This is the one we need. They sue Georgia. Famous case, Worchester versus Georgia. This is Chief Justice John Marshall. Here's the argument they made, and I think it's brilliant. If any of you want to be a lawyer, this is a good one to study. They argued that the laws of the United States did not apply to them. And here's their reason. They have a treaty with the United States giving them this land. And they pointed at the Constitution, and they showed in the Constitution where it says that the Senate has the authority to enter into treaties with foreign nations. Since the Senate had ratified a treaty with them, they therefore must be a foreign nation. And foreign nations do not have to follow the laws of the United States. Is that a good argument? Mm-hmm. It's a really smart argument. So they used their own laws against them. They said, therefore, your laws don't apply, you can't order us to move. The Supreme Court agreed with them. Chief Justice John Marshall Harlan rules that the Cherokee Nation was an independent nation living entirely inside the borders of Georgia. And because they were separate, they did not have to follow, and you cannot force them to be removed. Well, that should settle it, right? It's been settled now. They don't have to leave. Well, except Andrew Jackson's president. And Jackson responds with this quote, "Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." What does that mean?
Let them try and do it.
Yeah. Yeah. You try and stop me from moving them. Andrew Jackson pushed through the Indian Removal Act in 1830, and he ordered all these Indians moved west of the Mississippi River. Now, I will tell you, this is the single biggest scar on Andrew Jackson. But I did my graduate work on Andrew Jackson, and I got the privilege of reading a lot of his papers. And in Jackson's own words, in his diaries, he wrote about this stuff. And he says in his diary that he believes that more lives were saved by removing the Indians, by leaving them. And he goes on to explain that if I leave the Cherokees there, as John Marshall ordered, the people of Georgia will kill all of them. If I move them to Indian Territory, what's today Oklahoma, some may survive.
But didn't a lot of them die?
A lot of them did die. A lot of them did die. But I think he's right. I think the people of Georgia would have killed all of them. Okay? So, was he right to move them? Absolutely not. He wasn't right to move them. It was their land. They should have been protected. But was his justification there? Yeah, I think it was. I don't think it was all racist. Okay? I think part of it was. And part of the reason I say this is because Andrew Jackson himself, in the Creek Wars, whenever they were fighting the Creeks, he found an Indian baby whose parents had been killed by his men in the fighting. And Andrew Jackson had taken that Indian child home to his wife, and he and Rachel had raised it as their own child. So this was not the heartless monster that he seems, okay? Was he brutal? Absolutely. Was he racist? Absolutely, by today's standards, without a doubt. But he wasn't the monster that we often see. So do the Indians move? Most did. Somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 Choctaws voluntarily left. They were promised land. They were promised a check for the rest of their life. By the way, there are Indians and Indian reservations that still today get checks every year from the federal government because their family agreed to this, okay? So they get money for this. Most of them accepted it, not all. Those that didn't accept it were forcibly removed. We call this the Trail of Tears.
Yeah, I remember this.
Between 1832 and 1833, about 45,000 Indians were pushed into what's today Oklahoma. Unfortunately, crooked Indian, my brain's not working right now, guys. Crooked government men came through here and oftentimes spent the money themselves and damaged the Indians. They bought spoiled meat because it was cheaper, and the Indians died from that. They bought blankets from hospitals, sometimes with smallpox in them, and that wipes out a lot of the Indians. And they got to Oklahoma, and they find that they've been moved from this beautiful black dirt Georgia land to the deserts of Oklahoma. Now, they got the last laugh. It turns out there's oil underneath it. But we didn't know that then. So these farming people are stuck on this worthless land. The Seminoles chose not to be removed. They fought to the end. Chief Osceola and Philip, that's Osceola up there, a painting of him. Yes, that's a guy. But Osceola and Philip chose to fight. And the Seminoles were wiped out as an Indian nation. They killed every last one of them.
So Jackson was right.
Yeah, there are no full-blood Seminoles left. The only ones that are there are the descendants of the white women and Seminoles that were allowed to live. Exterminated. And that's what happens if you choose not to move. I'm going to skip the Texas part. This is in the Texas history class. I think I can finish this today, so I want to keep going. All right, 1836 comes along. Jackson chooses not to run for a third term, thank goodness. He was ancient. But his second vice president, the guy that ran with him in 1832, Martin Van Buren, gets the nod. That's him on the left. Single greatest haircut in the history of politics right there. Martin Van Buren runs against William Henry Harrison and two other minor candidates. Martin Van Buren easily wins 170 to 73. The problem is Martin Van Buren is never going to be able to rule like Jackson was. And he's going to be stuck with a lot of Jackson's problems. Okay? This is a pretty famous cartoon. I don't know if you can tell what it is or not, but that's Andrew Jackson carrying Martin Van Buren into the Capitol. What the artist is trying to say is the only reason Van Buren got elected is because
He did everything for him.
because Jackson was popular. Van Buren was the first president born after independence. So the first president born in the United States. All the rest have been born English citizens. He's not going to have the support of either party because the Democratic Party was built around Andrew Jackson. He's not Jackson. And the National Republican Party doesn't like him because he ran as a Democrat. He inherited the bad economy of Jackson, and he tried to fix the bank problem by creating a halfway bank called the Independent Treasury System. In 1840, it doesn't work. Our economy collapses. We have, starting in 1836, we have the worst economic depression this country saw until 1929. Things were bad. So bad that in 1840, we have a replay. Martin Van Buren challenges William Henry Harrison again for the presidency. But this time, Martin Van Buren is going to run as Andrew Jackson. What does that mean? Martin Van Buren runs a campaign called the Log Cabin Campaign, where he pretends he doesn't want to be president, and he tells everybody His nickname is now Old Tip because he was the hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe. He had killed Tecumseh at that battle. He runs as a war hero, and he tells everybody that he'd rather sit in his rocking chair on the front porch of his log cabin drinking whiskey and hard cider than be president. And Americans loved that. This was the first real fancy campaign. His campaign slogan is Tippecanoe and Tyler too. He had music that went with it. You can go find it on YouTube if you ever want to look for it. It's by a band. There's a band called They May Be Giants, or They Might Be Giants, that does it. A cover of it called Tippecanoe and Tyler too. It's really bizarre. He runs with John Tyler, and Americans seem to really love the fact that this guy doesn't want to be president. He's also the oldest man elected president until Ronald Reagan. He is 68 years old when he's elected. William Henry Harrison wins easily. And I'd like to tell you he'd be a great president, but we'll never know. Because at 68 years old, William Henry Harrison gave a 3-hour inaugural address on the front steps of the White House during a blizzard. And he caught pneumonia and died 28 days later. So he was only president 28 days. John Tyler becomes the first vice president to be raised to the office of presidency upon the death of a president. Okay? All right. We're going to stop there. That gets us through Andrew Jackson. No class next week. We're all out of school, I think. I know we're out of school here. I think y'all are too at other campuses. So I will see you in a week. Y'all have a good one.
We don't have school the Monday after next.